predator becomes prey in the Florida Everglades as hundreds of hunters descend on the Sunshine State to catch and kill as many Burmese pythons as possible.
A trail camera strapped to a cypress trunk in the Big Cypress National Preserve was never supposed to make anyone's stomach drop. It was just one of dozens scattered through the wetlands, quietly logging whatever walked past for weeks at a time. But when researchers finally pulled the footage, what they found wasn't a rare animal or a beautiful sunrise over the sawgrass. It was silence, frame after frame of an empty trail, night after night, with nothing moving through it at all. In a swamp that used to be loud with life, that silence is the scariest thing on the tape. To understand why an empty trail camera can feel like a horror movie, you have to go back more than 30 years, to a hurricane that nobody connected to snakes at the time. In August of 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida with winds over 165 miles per hour, killing dozens of people and causing tens of billions of dollars in damage. Amid the wreckage, a number of private animal breeding facilities were destroyed, including ones that housed exotic reptiles. Cages broke open, fences came down, and somewhere in that chaos, an unknown number of Burmese pythons, already established in Florida through the exotic pet trade, escaped into the wild. At the same time, over the following years, thousands of pet owners across South Florida found themselves with a problem. A cute 2-foot hatchling had grown into an 8, 10, or 12-foot snake that was expensive to feed and increasingly hard to handle. Rather than surrender the animals to shelters, many owners simply drove to the edge of the Everglades and let them go, assuming they were doing the humane thing. What those owners were actually doing was seeding an invasion into one of the most forgiving environments a giant constrictor snake could ask for. The Everglades is over 1.5 million acres of subtropical wetland with warm temperatures nearly year-round, abundant fresh water, and a food supply that had never needed to defend itself against anything like a Burmese python. Raccoons, possums, marsh rabbits, and even deer had spent thousands of years evolving around native predators like alligators, bobcats, and endangered Florida panther. None of that evolutionary history prepared them for an ambush predator that can sense body heat in total darkness, lie motionless in a few inches of water for hours, and strike with a speed the human eye can barely register. Wildlife ecologists have described the situation as native prey walking straight past a predator they simply don't recognize as one, the way you might walk past a coiled garden hose without a second thought. The snakes didn't just survive in this new environment, they thrived. A single female Burmese python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a clutch, and with essentially no natural predators to keep the population in check, the numbers didn't just grow, they exploded. Today, wildlife agencies estimate the Burmese python population in South Florida is somewhere in the tens of thousands, with some estimates running into the hundreds of thousands across the full range of the invasion. That is an enormous number of apex predators occupying a niche that, 20 years earlier, had no apex predator in it at all. The clearest evidence of what that meant for native wildlife came from a landmark study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012, led by researchers including Michael Dorcas and John Wilson. The team compared nighttime road survey data collected across the Everglades between 2003 and 2011 to older survey data from the mid-1990s, before pythons had become established. The results were staggering. Raccoon sightings had dropped by 99.3%. Opossum sightings were down 98.9%. Bobcat sightings had fallen by 87.5%. And white-tailed deer sightings had dropped by more than 94%. Rabbits and foxes, once common enough to be considered a nuisance by park staff fielding complaint calls, simply vanished from the survey data entirely. These weren't modest declines. They were population collapses, and they lined up almost perfectly with the timeline and geography of the python invasion. Researchers who have spent decades studying the Everglades describe driving the same roads they drove in the 1980s and finding almost nothing left to see. Where wildlife sightings once came every few hundred yards, some stretches now go on for miles without a single set of eyes reflecting back in the headlights. That's not a minor ecological hiccup. The Everglades provides flood protection and water filtration for millions of people in South Florida and helps recharge the drinking water aquifers for one of the fastest-growing regions in the country. Economists have placed the ecosystem's annual value in the tens of billions of dollars. The small and mid-sized mammals, the pythons, have been quietly erasing weren't a footnote in that system. They were part of the machinery that keeps it running. Florida's response has been aggressive, but the scale of the problem has made it an uphill battle from the start. The state runs an annual Florida Python Challenge, a public hunting competition that draws hundreds of participants each year. In recent years, that event has removed only a few hundred snakes, a number that barely registers against a population estimated in the tens of thousands. Beyond the public competition, Florida also employs paid contractors, professional python hunters, who work the levees and back roads at night, sweeping headlamps across the brush looking for a shape that doesn't quite match the vegetation around it. Since that contractor program began in 2017, hunters have removed tens of thousands of pythons combined, and yet researchers believe that total likely represents only a small fraction of the snakes actually out there. New technology hasn't solved the problem either. Thermal drones struggle to pick out cold-blooded snakes that sit at roughly the same temperature as their surroundings. Robotic decoys meant to lure pythons into the open have largely been ignored, because pythons are patient ambush predators, built to wait for real prey to come to them rather than chase after something artificial. The one approach that has shown real promise is what researchers call the scout snake method. Biologists surgically implant a GPS tracker into a mature male python, release him back into the wild, and let his own biology do the work. During breeding season, that male will travel toward the largest, most reproductively active females in the area, leading researchers directly to breeding aggregations they would otherwise never find. Conservation groups working in Southwest Florida have used this technique to locate and remove some of the largest breeding females ever recorded in the state. Still, even the most effective tracking method covers only a fraction of an ecosystem that spans well over 1 million acres, and some veteran hunters have started to suggest something unsettling, that the surviving snakes seem to be growing warier, retreating deeper into the areas where humans rarely go. If that were the whole story, it would already be one of the largest invasive species crises in the country. But it isn't the whole story, and the second half of it is arguably more alarming than the pythons themselves. While screening wild-caught native snakes for general health, herpetologists in Florida began noticing something wrong that had nothing to do with pythons directly. Garter snakes, pygmy rattlesnakes, and eastern diamondbacks were turning up emaciated, lethargic, and struggling to breathe. Necropsies revealed the cause. The lungs of these animals were packed with small, pale, thread-like parasites, visibly alive and moving, in numbers dense enough to be suffocating the snake from the inside. In some cases, live snakes were found with the parasites emerging from their mouths because the animals were too weak to keep them closed. The organism responsible is a pentastome, a crustacean-like parasite called Rhylidiella orientalis, and researchers believe it arrived in Florida the same way the pythons did, native to Southeast Asia, and carried here inside the bodies of the snakes that brought it. In its natural range, this parasite and the Burmese python have a long shared evolutionary history, and pythons there tolerate it without severe illness. Florida's native snakes have no such history. Their immune systems have never had to deal with this parasite, and the effects can be devastating. The transmission pathway is part of what makes it so difficult to contain. An infected python sheds waste containing microscopic larvae. Cockroaches, common throughout the Everglades, feed on that waste and pick up the larvae. A native frog eats an infected cockroach. A native snake eats the frog. That chain of predation is exactly how the Everglades food web has always worked, which is precisely why the parasite has been able to spread through it so efficiently. Once inside a snake, the larvae migrate to the respiratory system and mature there, gradually filling the airways until the animal can no longer breathe properly. Research led by parasitologist Melissa Miller and colleagues at the University of Florida and Auburn University has documented this parasite in at least 17 to 18 distinct native snake species, with its range extending well beyond South Florida into the central and even northern parts of the state, hundreds of miles from where the pythons themselves are established. Perhaps the most troubling finding in that research is that the parasite no longer needs pythons to keep spreading. It has become self-sustaining within the native snake and amphibian community, cycling through cockroaches, frogs, and snakes on its own. That means even a scenario where every python in Florida was somehow removed overnight would do nothing to stop this parasite. It is already woven into the ecosystem on its own terms. So Florida is effectively fighting two invasions at once. Pythons are hollowing out the mammal community from the top of the food chain, while an introduced parasite is quietly working through the native reptile community from underneath. There is at least one flicker of unexplained hope in the data. Some studies screening native snake species for this parasite have found the Florida cottonmouth carrying unusually low parasite loads compared to other species living in the same heavily infected areas. Researchers don't yet know why, but there's a chance that whatever biological quirk protects cottonmouths could eventually point toward ways to protect other vulnerable species as well. Against this backdrop of decline, one conservation story stands out as a genuine bright spot, and it comes with an ironic twist. It involves releasing snakes into the wild on purpose. The eastern indigo snake is native to the southeastern United States and is the longest native snake species in North America, capable of reaching lengths of 8 feet or more. Its scales are a deep, glossy black that can shimmer with hints of blue and purple in direct sunlight, and it has long been considered one of the most striking reptiles in the region. Unlike the invasive python, the eastern indigo is not a threat to the ecosystem. It's a species that had nearly disappeared from large parts of its former range. Habitat loss tied to Florida's development boom, particularly the conversion of native longleaf pine forest into agricultural and residential land, devastated populations of gopher tortoises, whose burrows the indigo snake depends on for shelter. As tortoise populations declined, so did the indigos, and by the late 1970s the species was functionally gone from much of North Florida and the surrounding region. What makes the eastern indigo ecologically important is its diet. It is an ophiophagyst, meaning it specializes in eating other snakes, and it is remarkably resistant to the venom of the pit vipers native to North America, including rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouths. An adult eastern indigo can overpower and consume venomous snakes that would be lethal to most other predators, which is part of why researchers sometimes describe it as one of the more formidable predators at ground level in its native forests. Conservation groups, including the Orient Society, spent years working to bring the species back, not just through captive breeding, but through habitat restoration, rebuilding longleaf pine ecosystems, reintroducing prescribed fire regimes, and reestablishing the gopher tortoise burrow networks that indigo snakes need to survive. Once suitable habitat was ready, captive-bred eastern indigos were released into protected preserves in the Florida Panhandle. In the years since, researchers have documented something they had been hoping for but couldn't guarantee: evidence of wild-hatched eastern indigo snakes, meaning young snakes that were conceived, laid, and hatched entirely in the wild without human intervention. For a species that had been effectively absent from the region for half a century, that's a significant milestone, suggesting the reintroduced population may be capable of sustaining and growing itself over time. There's a broader question hanging over all of this, and it's one that connects the python crisis, the parasite crisis, and the indigo recovery story together. Could a native predator like the eastern indigo eventually help control young pythons? A small, juvenile Burmese python falls within a size range that an adult eastern indigo could plausibly overpower, and every juvenile python that doesn't survive to breeding age represents one less potential source of new eggs. Researchers who study the species are careful to say that this kind of predation hasn't been directly observed in the wild, and that a fully grown python weighing well over 100 pounds is an entirely different matchup than a young one. It remains an open question rather than a confirmed solution. There's also a genuine concern shadowing the indigo's recovery. If the introduced lungworm parasite were ever able to infect eastern indigo populations before those populations become large and stable enough to absorb the losses, it could undermine decades of restoration work before it has a chance to fully take hold. The indigo's resistance to viper venom is a very specific biological trait tied to its blood chemistry, and there's no particular reason to assume that resistance extends to an unrelated parasite with a completely different biology. For now, it's simply something researchers are watching closely. Meanwhile, There are early signs that some of Florida's native predators may be starting to adapt to the pythons themselves. Wildlife cameras and field researchers across the Everglades have documented bobcats, alligators, and even the critically endangered Florida panther engaging with pythons in ways that weren't expected when the invasion first took hold, treating the snakes as potential prey rather than simply ignoring them. A python that has just eaten a large meal becomes sluggish and vulnerable for days at a time, and cooler temperatures can suppress its metabolism and reaction speed even further. Whether this kind of native predation will ever meaningfully slow the python population remains uncertain, but after 2 decades of the invasion having essentially no natural check on its growth, any sign of pushback is notable. What the trail cameras of the Everglades have really captured, across all of this, is a story in 2 parts. One part is a warning about how quickly an ecosystem can be hollowed out when an invasive species, with no natural predators, is allowed to establish itself.